This video is brought to you by Loopmaster's LoopCloud 4.0, a completely free to download app where you can slice, edit, remix millions of samples, and then just, drag them right into your DAW. Boom, done. You can click the link in the description below to download it and follow along with me in this video as I use it to help make the song we're about to learn, which sounds like this. Hello there, my inspirations. My name is Inspirasper, and today I'm going to teach you how to make a lo-fi hip-hop beat that you can study and relax to. Lo-fi is short for low fidelity. This just basically means the song has a lower production quality than your average professionally produced track. The lower production quality generally stems from imperfections in the track, such as white noise or vinyl crack, static. These imperfections seem to replicate a nostalgic feeling. These tracks tend to be slower, more of a down-tempo beat, and overall, of course, as I mentioned, they are just intended to be used to relax to study. And so first things first, when you go to produce a lo-fi track, you need to come across some good samples. I did the majority of my sample digging using LoopCloud 4.0, as I pointed out in the beginning of this video. This is a third-party application made by Loopmasters. You can download for free, again, link in the description below, where you can search for millions of samples. LoopCloud is really cool in that you can search for your specific samples, and then you can play them in the application itself, so you can get a sample for what samples you are downloading. Maybe I'm looking for a down-tempo classical guitar tonal C. Oh, okay, here we go. Oh wait, no, that's actually pretty cool. Honestly, one of the things I love the most is that you can buy samples individually. Once these samples are in your library, you can edit them to your liking. You can adjust their pitch, change the key that they're in. You can adjust their BPM. This is all a very high-level overview. There's so much more to it. So just take my word for it and know that there are plenty more features. So now let's learn how to use these samples in the making of our song, this lo-fi track. First things first, I wanted to focus on the percussion. I really love the feeling of a lo-fi down-tempo beat. First things first, let's set our BPM. Lo-fi tracks tend to be slower. You're not restricted to this BPM, but I chose 81, something in the lower territory. Here's what I made for my percussion, and I'll go through step by step, layer by layer on how I made it. First things first are my kicks. I went into LoopCloud and I searched for lo-fi samples, and I searched through to find kicks that I particularly enjoyed. So I downloaded them and then just dragged them into Ableton. Boom. Done. It's worth mentioning that I'm using Ableton as my DAW. The concepts learned in this video can be transferred to any other DAW. You don't have to be restricted to just Ableton. I dragged 3 kick samples that I liked onto my drum rack in Ableton, although I only ended up using 2. I laid out my kick samples in this following pattern. On this MIDI track, I added in an EQ, as well as a glue compressor to help tie these two sounds together, make it a little bit easier on your ears. You don't want anything to be harsh in the lo-fi track. Next, I went to looking for snares. Same thing as before, I went searching for snare samples in LoopCloud. I found a few that I liked, that I particularly enjoyed, and then I added in the samples that I liked onto this drum rack. I laid out my snares in this following pattern. And on my snares layer, I also added in an EQ. A good EQ for snares is just boosting the mid-lows, kind of in between the low and the mid, and the very high ends. Together with my kicks, this is the very basics of my drum beat. The next thing I went to looking for was some shakers. Notice I lowered the gain of this layer by a lot, -27 decibels. These shakers don't need to be very prominent. In fact, they are meant to be very subtle. One of those things where you know it's there, but you don't actively register that it's there. If it were taken away, it doesn't feel right. Later on in my track, I added in a second layer of shakers. Using LoopCloud, I found this cymbal loop. However, I didn't really like this second cymbal, the every other cymbal. It didn't really jive with me, so I sliced it up and laid it out in this following pattern. On both these shaker layers, I added in the following audio effects. Just an EQ to really accentuate the high ends and cut off all the low ends. I don't need this excess frequency range down here, it's not needed. And a stereo finalizer. If you follow this channel, you know this is one of my favorite plugins. This just widens the sound of your track. It really emphasizes the stereo surround sound of your sample. Here's my 2 shaker layers without any audio effects. And then with them. All together now, my percussion. Next, I went to looking for hi-hats and other miscellaneous foley percussion. I have this layer of hi-hats, where I found this sample in Loop Cloud, of course, and added in an EQ, again, emphasizing those high ends. Lowered this by 13 decibels, and then also added in some supplementary percussion foley, what have you. This was my miscellaneous layer, so I just found some generic percussion that I liked, just weird odds and ends samples. So then everything so far, my kicks, snares, shakers, and hi-hats, and lastly, I went to looking for some cymbals. So I found 3 different cymbals that I liked, these crashes, rides. My first one, which I added a few audio effects on top of, namely being an EQ to accentuate the high ends, cut off the lows, a reverb and delay to add some space into the sound, a stereo finalizer and a dimension expander to widen my stereo sound, and a kickstart, which I will get into why that's important later, without any audio effects, and then with. My second cymbal effect, and then my last big ride sample with similar audio effects. You may notice the delay on this one was to a different rate than my first sample. I placed these cymbals at the tops of certain bars. A lot of times it was after every 4 bars, where it felt most natural for a build-up to be, for a crash to happen. Similarly, paired with these crashes, I also have a reversed cymbal to build up. So then all together, one more time, my percussion sounds like this. Next, let's move on to my layer of chords. This is where our song finally gets some life to it. So I made a separate MIDI layer, and this was the chord progression that I came up with. I ended up making this track in G sharp minor. From there, I went to working on sound design. I wanted this layer of chords to be either strings or a choir, and I chose the latter. So I found a Serum preset that emulated exactly what I wanted, this choir, dark choir preset. From here, I added in sound effects such as an EQ, where I cut off the low ends and a bit of the high ends, and I also added in a kickstart. Now, I mentioned this before. This is important because I feel like this gives the track a bouncy feel. Not in an energetic way, maybe more of a wavy feel. Feels like you're flowing. And then I added in 2 compressors, which I've side changed to my kicks and snares. This allows my percussion to breathe a little bit. It pops through these chords a little bit better. I added in a second layer of chords, same exact concept, just with a different preset. I grouped these 2 together and made sure I cut off the low ends with an EQ. This is important because it gives my bass room to breathe, which is a perfect segue because let's learn how to make the bass. For the bass, I made a separate MIDI track. I used the bottom notes of my chords as inspiration, not as a strict boundary for what notes my bass should play. And then I added in an instance of Serum with an 808 preset. Now I know lo-fi doesn't tend to be very bass heavy. This is because it's meant to be relaxing, and bass can generally be pretty strenuous on your head, especially if you listen to it for prolonged periods of time. That being said, we can work with this and make it a little bit more subtle. I added in a whole series of audio effects, the most prominent being a utility, where I turn this into mono, and an EQ8, where I isolate the low ends. The rest, being compressors and saturators, are just to bring out the sound a little bit better. I also added in a kickstart to give it that same wavy feel as the chords. So far, this is what we have. So far sounding pretty good, let's go ahead and add in a layer of leads. I drew up this melody, I essentially played my chords, added in a new MIDI layer, and then just drew in a melody that I thought fit with that layer of chords. I have several layers of leads, so let's go ahead and go through a few of them. First, I have this layer. Just an instance of Serum, and this EQ. Second layer of leads. Third layer of leads. Fourth layer. And a fifth layer that's a detuned piano. All together, all of my leads. So I know I kind of brushed through that just for the sake of time, sorry. But the main takeaway here is that you need to draw up a melody that you like, something that fits with your chords. Be sure to spend a good chunk of time on this. I'd probably spend a solid half hour just perfecting the melody, just getting something that I like. And then once you have that, stack a bunch of layers on top of each other that complement each other. And then on these layers, I added in a good bit of audio effects, but the main takeaway here, try to EQ to isolate only the frequencies that you need. We don't need very low ends. We don't need very, very high ends. Consider adding in a little bit of reverb, add some compressors to really make the sound punch out a little bit better, and then group all of these together. Add in some sidechaining to your percussion. Again, we want that to stand out. And then you should have something that plays well with the rest of our track so far. Next, let's consider adding in some backup melodies. I consider what I just made to be my primary melody, and then I also want some supporting melodies going on in the background just to make things a little bit more exciting. I have two layers here, one being a piano and one being a guitar-ish, simulated in an instance of Serum, that sound like this. And then my layer of pianos. Be sure to add in all the audio effects that you need to your discretion, group them together and see how that sounds with the rest of your track. Finally, the nice little cherry on top of our beautiful little sundae is just a bit of vinyl scratch. This is just static sound. Normally, this is considered unwanted, undesired in a professionally produced song, but in this case, the little imperfections is exactly what makes it a bit of a lo-fi vibe track. So I found this sample. EQ'd just the high ends. We don't want anything too crazy in the low ends, or even in the mids. That clutters up the rest of our track. And just like that, you've made a lo-fi track. Now granted, I know it's not perfect, but at least it's something to get you off the ground, maybe potentially inspire you to make something of your own, something of the like. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please do me a favor and download Loop Cloud, link in the description below. It'll really help me out, it'll help loop masters out, they deserve it. That being said, here's our lo-fi track. Thank you for watching, guys. I really appreciate it. Bye.